Let's make a start with this afternoon's session. We will be joined by Tim Dixon, the co-founder of Purpose, but apparently Paddington Station, they've stopped all the trains going out of Paddington for the last 3 hours. So poor Tim is sitting in an Uber on his way here, but I'm told he should be here in about 5 or 10 minutes. So we've heard a lot today about, and we heard a lot this afternoon already about the divide, the political divide between citizens and their governments. And in this session, we're going to talk about how we engage citizens through political communication. So before we move to our panelists, I'd like to hear from you. What's the question that you've come to this panel thinking, this is what I want them to answer? Any thoughts on that? Who's come with a question in their mind? This is what I want the answer to. Yeah. Eric.
How do we get...
Sorry, I've caught everybody short.
Hi there. How can we have more two-way communications between people in politics and government and those that have something to say in return?
By asking for questions at the beginning. No, just thank you. Across to here.
Starting with the first word, engage. How do politicians actually engage? Right now we have a lot of low information voters who might be listening only close to the time of the election, not paying very much attention. How do we actually get voters to be more engaged?
Thank you. And then to the back.
In the post-Arab Spring period, most of the top UK British communication companies were associated with laundering the reputations of many of the dictators that were falling around the Arab world. How does the communication industry recover a reputation for actually doing the right thing rather than the lucrative thing?
Indeed, we had Praveen Gordhan here last week telling us about Bell Pottinger's activities in South Africa on the payroll of the Gupta family, which I don't think has covered that communications company in glory. You were grimacing. Are you from a communications company? No. No. Right. Yes, please do. Can we have the microphone up here?
So I suppose my question is, how do we engage deeply? By which I mean not just telling people a story we've already made up, but actually getting them to design the story and indeed empowering them to be the storytellers. So is there actually a much deeper process here of conversation and recognising that others are expert?
Great. Yes. And Sarah, if you can take
There seems to be a disjuncture between print and broadcast media and politicians. How can the space that is being taken up by social media be inserted more into this two-way street that's more inclusive?
Thank you.
Yeah, I was interested to know if there would be any accountability of what governments communicate to their constituencies. Yeah, true. If I lied, I would be taken to court.
And across to you, Danielle.
So how can we use communication to build consensus and not just to reinforce the beliefs that people already have?
Great. And over there.
Thanks. So a lot of coverage after the election of Trump in the US focused on the use of psychological targeting techniques through social media. And there's a sense in the light of the UK general election recently that possibly the more progressive forces were more effective in their use of social media in that election. So was it simply a case that in the US the Democrats were slow to catch up with techniques, and in the future there'll be a level playing field that targets us all very intelligently? Or should we worry about the use of, if you like, deeper targeting than the more straightforward marketing?
Brilliant. Yes, one more.
Just two quick questions for me. What are the differences of political communications between mature democracies and other forms of democracies? If there exists any difference of communications, for instance, the Chinese and the Vietnamese model vis-a-vis the US and the Western European models.
Great, and I'm delighted to say that Tim Dixon has just arrived, and I think we'll come in and join us. Tim, I'm just welcoming you. do come in.
Thank you.
We've explained your circumstances.
I guess I should sort of, exclaim, wow, the railways need to be nationalised. But that would put me somewhere on a political spectrum, wouldn't it?
Great.
My apologies for my late arrival.
I once made the mistake of sitting on a train on a hot day when the trains in Britain do stop and exclaiming to the man beside me, how is it that in Britain trains can't run in 30-degree temperatures when they can run across the Sahara at 46? I said it to the wrong man. He was a railways engineer, and I got 45 minutes on metal expansion, contraction, and temperatures. So there we go. I won't. But we've started with questions from the audience that they very much hope will be answered. And those questions have really focused on the issues. One is around how can communications be two-way instead of one-way? So how do we move to actually listening to citizens, engaging citizens, and getting beyond the world of political spin? Second, the role of social media versus the old-fashioned, print and broadcast media. Third, how can we hold governments accountable for what they communicate? And how do we use communications to build consensus? Sure. Great. Kind of like an invitation to sing karaoke, but we won't. You really don't want us doing that. So I'd like to start with getting each of our speakers to help us decode what's going on in the world of communications. The recent elections around the world have given us a picture of a world now driven by social media, where politicians who win, whether they're Macron or Trump, are the politicians who are really savvy in their use of social media. It's a world in which the citizenship seem incredibly polarized. So most of us have read the research on echo chambers and the degree to which social media, because the communications are private, is separating society, and because algorithms are being used to take us not just to websites that we might enjoy, but to specific elements of those websites, so that half the time we're not even aware that we're in an echo chamber and we're only seeing this part of a website because it reflects our preferences. So it looks as though at the moment that communications as we know it is actually part of the problem, because it's creating these echo chambers, magnifying differences, driving politics which is more divided. But I'm joined by three communications experts who are all kind of professionally engaged in using communication to do positive things. So I think they should be able to tell us that either this is not the case or it is. So let me start by asking Nick Lovegrove, who's a partner at the Brunswick Group. And Nick, I can't help but start with the question that the audience put. Is Brunswick worried about the fact that some of what it does is laundering the reputations of people who are not contributing positively to public life, and we saw activists this morning who are about making transparent the bad activities of others? Is that what Brunswick's doing, or is Brunswick worried about doing that? And how does Brunswick keep up with this new revolution in social media?
Thanks, Mary. Laundering is a very loaded word. I think it is obviously the job of communications professionals to help their clients tell their best story and to put themselves in the best possible light. I think there is a responsibility, a desire on the part of most firms to self-regulate that and to make judgments about whom they're willing to do that for and whom they're not. A private firm can basically select its own clients, and Brunswick does that, and it does certainly turn down clients because it doesn't want to tell their story or doesn't believe their story can be told in an acceptable way. But I think that sort of reflects the fact that the communications profession, the communications arena, is a client-driven business, and that's even true in government. If you think about a sort of constant back and forth between the corporate communications sector and the political communications sector. And it's interesting to track over time the influence that the one has had over the other. I was reflecting on the several eras that we've gone through even in my lifetime. In the 80s, there was a big transference of communications people and techniques from the corporate world to the political world. One remembers, actually you mentioned Bell Pottinger. Tim Bell was almost the archpriest of that movement with Margaret Thatcher and Maurice Saatchi, and in the US people like Michael Deaver helping Ronald Reagan build his profile. Later on, it went kind of the other way. The Obama campaign famously kind of span off a whole bunch of incredibly bright, clever, young communications people into the corporate world, and by that stage the non-profit world as well, since the non-profit arena had grown to a scale where it could deploy such capability. And you had people like David Plouffe working for Uber, and it also become global, and you had people moving around the world doing this. And then you come to the current situation and you say, well, where are we? Well, we've now got a period of time where the prevailing model seems to be essentially that of corporate activism. The sort of high priest of, certainly in the US today, is Carl Icahn. You know, Donald Trump, famously observes that Carl Icahn really has taught him everything he knows about communication. And it turns out that, at least in the narrow microcosm of this particular election, was a brilliantly successful thing to do. And Ali, I think, explained very clearly why it resonated so well. Not clear that it's a model for government. It's a model for campaigning, but it's not clear that it's a model for government. But I think we're still at the point of really trying to address the question that came up from several people in the audience, is how to make this interactive, if you like. In theory, social media is an interactive platform. It enables two-way, multi-directional communication. But in its use in politics and in so much of the corporate world as well, it's essentially just a different way to spread the word, try to energize and engage, but energizing really with one objective in mind, which is vote for me. And it hasn't yet followed through into vote for me in order to do the following, and I want to keep you involved. And just a final word, I'll say, I think the fault for that lies on both the left and the right, from the political and the non-profit world. And if I could cite an example of failed expectations, Obama's Organizing for America campaign, which was essentially the attempt to turn the political campaign into a campaign of engagement around solving problems, just never really went anywhere. It just sort of floundered, and people just eventually gave up and went off into their various other activities. And that reflects how difficult this is to do, even with the media that we now have at our disposal.
Thank you, Nick. Any questions for Nick on what he just said? Yeah. In ancient Athens, talking to people was important. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
You show that you have principles you believed in. And I wonder whether both with Trump actually, as well as with Corbyn, that is coming to the forefront again. They're not faking it. People don't think they're faking it, they really believe in that. Whereas in the previous political engagement, there was a lot of spin and PR around it, and people got tired of that. Could you have, my question is, could you have the success of those two movements without the kind of ethos? So it fizzles out as soon as you believe this person is spinning me a story and therefore not going to engage with you more.
Yeah, no, very good. When you can manufacture authenticity, you do really well, wouldn't you? I mean, I think that is I think what you say is absolutely right. I should explain, I live in the US, have done for the last 10 years, and watching the campaign last year with both Trump and Sanders, I was wondering whether a British politician could evoke the same emotions. I specifically wondered whether Corbyn could be the Bernie Sanders, could achieve the Bernie Sanders effect in the UK. And it looked for a long time like he couldn't, and then all of a sudden he did.
But Nick, so without revealing all your trade secrets, is part of what you do as a communications consultant helping people manufacture their authenticity? I mean, is that part of the business, and how do you do it?
I'm not sure it's I wish there were trade secrets to evoke. I think you are certainly trying to find the best, the thing that works for any individual in communicating their story. Sometimes that can be being a populist. But if you, let's take, for instance, Mark Zuckerberg. Mark Zuckerberg's a technocrat, right? I mean, he's a brilliantly clever technological geek. He is clearly now at a point in his time, in his life, where he is both setting high aspirations for social change and dealing with very significant concern about the platform that he's created. He has to turn himself quite quickly into a politician, if you like. Not necessarily because he wants to run for office, although who knows, he may well do that down the road, but because right now his platform is directly engaged in the political process. If he can't find an authentic, believable way to do that, then he's going to have a real problem on his hands. Facebook is going to become a pariah of democracy rather than a driver of engagement. And that's a worthwhile challenge for anybody to want to engage in.
Thank you. Damian Tambini is sitting on my left, and he heads media and communications at the LSE. Is that right? Yep. I've got, you've got many roles, and that's one of them. And I guess some of us in this room would think that the showing people to their best effect, as it were, that the revolution in spin in politics is actually a huge part of the problem. That we have these pre-packaged politicians that never go off message, and the public heave a sigh of relief when they read Trump's sort of unadulterated tweeting, and they listen to Jeremy Corbyn's commentary, because it's not pre-packaged. It hasn't been formulaically. Is that where we are? How do you read the current state of political communications?
Well, I think the ongoing crisis that is engulfing our Prime Minister at the moment is precisely to do with that point, that she has been criticised for embracing the old school of political campaigning, small target, tight control of the message, repetition of a very simple message, and she's been punished for that because people don't believe her. She's wooden, she hasn't engaged, it's not interactive, and she's not listening. She will be punished next by her own party, who will not fight another election under her leadership, and the game has changed. That's absolutely clear. But if I could just pick up a few of the points that were made by the audience. The danger, I think, sometimes with thinking about, particularly during this populist revolution, thinking about these things, is that we blame the messenger, we blame the media. We say, okay, things are changing, somehow this might have something to do with changing the platform. The fact, and it's an undeniable fact, that political campaign has very rapidly moved online. No longer do 70% of people say that television is their primary source of political information. It's going down quite rapidly below 50%, particularly for younger age groups. So something is changing, but we can't blame our current political predicament on this. I think that's a dangerous step. I think we need to think about how politics is changing, how political ideologies and political parties fail to respond to the big structural changes that are happening. People are getting poorer. Risks of security, environment, and other global problems are not being met by the political actors that are currently on the market. So it's about politics, it's not about communication.
And what's the solution?
Well, I don't have a solution to all of that. We need to change politics, and we need new political actors. We need new political parties. But I don't, however, go as far as to say that this is nothing to do with the changing the changing communication technology. It is having an impact, and I think the question was raised about targeted campaigning, and I've been looking at that since I was asked by the Council of Europe about a year ago to write a report for them on the internet and elections, and to think about how international organisations, including those that do election monitoring, need to think about how these campaigns are changing. Facebook is where most political advertising spend goes now. So things have moved online, and Facebook is hoovering up most of the revenue. Organic, that is shares and likes, so grassroots campaigns, however, play an enormous role. So we saw the Corbyn campaign was incredibly successful, despite the fact that the Conservatives spent more. Why has it everything gone online? And you know, if you're not from the UK, which is quite, I think, on the leading edge of online campaigning, it's coming to your countries next. Okay, this big change in campaigning. Why is it going online? It's going online because it works. You can target marginal constituencies. You can target swing voters. You can target, on the basis of individual voters, a data-driven combination of their profile. So some fundamental changes in political campaigning, some of them driven by grassroots, but spend, direct advertising, targeted advertising is changing a lot. I think, and we could come to this, I think that the campaign regulation, which tries to guarantee a level playing field and tries to limit the role of money in elections, needs to change as well. And I think that there are a number of updates to data protection law, for example, that need to go along with that. We have current investigations which go back to the referendum in this country, which seem to indicate that the regulatory system for this is broken. And whilst freedom of expression is extremely important, we need to find that balance between free and open public debate and a situation in which propaganda and the platform power that you mentioned, the Zuckerberg power, doesn't become a very damaging factor in our democratic processes.
So just to pick up on that, you know, we live in an era where, certainly in a lot of the corporate world, and I think Brunswick probably operates on the proposition that you can't try and say different things to different audiences because it can all go online and be tweeted and everything else.
But a lot of the corporate work is effectively regulated by the stock exchange and by...
Right. But you're describing a world in which candidates can privately target very different messages to different individuals and different demographics. And one of the audience said, how do you hold candidates and politicians to account for what they say? You can't in that world, can you? Or do you think you can? Like, what is it positively that governments, candidates, people who are constructing the system should be thinking about in holding to account candidates?
Well, I mean, I think we can exaggerate to a certain extent the change. Politicians always said, didn't they, know your audience. And they went along to the Women's Institute and said one thing, and the Working Men's Club and said another thing. But Facebook enables you to do that in a much more systematic and cheaper way. So we're collaborating at the LSE with an organisation called Who Targets Me, which is a grassroots campaign that have persuaded during the last election 11,000 people to volunteer to download a browser plugin which into your Chrome browser, and this plugin scrapes the data out of your Facebook feed, and it puts it into a structured database that we're busily analysing, and you can read about it on the LSE Media Policy Project blog. We just posted some of the results a few minutes ago. But why was that grassroots campaign successful in mobilising quite so many people to volunteer? Because people are worried about that very issue, about the profiling and targeting based on that profiling, and the problem of what you might call dark ads. These are ads which appear in your Facebook feed. You see them, then they disappear. So one of the things that we're doing and Who Targets Me are doing is to create a repository of those ads. We don't have systematic evidence that either there are messages, although particularly the Conservatives' campaign was a very negative attack-based campaign, we don't have evidence that there are ads which are direct lies or that contradict one another. And you send one group to the Brexit target voter for the Labour Party and another to the Remain constituency, for example. We don't have a huge amount of evidence for direct contradiction, but it's theoretically possible that you get messages which are targeted at different constituencies, and that undermines the process of deliberation in society, and it also undermines the accountability process. You hold up the leaflet a year after the election and say, this is what you promised. And once you get this kind of targeting and this kind of fragmentation, that process is undermined.
Thank you very much. Any questions on what Damian's just said? Yes.
Hello, my name is Marek Shevich. I'm the director of comms for the Global NGO, and I worked at the BBC as a news editor for 20 years or so. It sounds to me like you're talking about something that isn't communication, it's actually marketing. And what I want to ask is, to what extent do you think political communication has moved onto marketing, and it's now much more about tapping into how people feel, and rather than trying to tell them facts? And successful politicians who do that tap into feelings of fear if they're Trump, or hope if they're Macron, and unsuccessful ones are still trying to tell audiences what they should feel or think, like Theresa May's recent campaign.
Do you want to take that now?
I mean, politics has always been emotional. I think it is certainly the case that what has happened is that we've moved from platforms which were either regulated for balance, like broadcasting, or ethically self-regulation and applying a filter of ethical journalism, for example, from those platforms onto completely unregulated platforms which are unfiltered except by the need for resonance. So we interviewed the leaders of the different campaigns around the Brexit referendum and found that they were testing messages purely on the numbers. So you start with two political messages, and it's called A/B testing. You say, we'll put one ad out there, or one meme, or one slogan, and we're alongside another one. Whichever gets the better shares and likes, we'll leave it up there, and we'll test another one against it. And you continue on that basis. Now, that doesn't seem to me a process of learning or ideological reflection. It's about the emotion, it's about the resonance, and that's where we are with political debate.
So the point raised, though, about are we moving into post-truth, post-fact politics, I think is one that is concerning everybody. And I'd just like to get a very quick comment on that from each of you before moving to Tim and talking about some solutions to some of these problems. But are we in post-fact, post-truth? Just a quick one-liner from each of you.
Post-fact or post-truth, it's not a thing. It's a political window. I mean, something different for Donald Trump, who says, fake news is anything I disagree with. And, on the other hand, there are Russian campaigns of misinformation producing something which is fake news, which is an assault on national security and undermining elections. So these are not the same thing. So we need to be very careful that whatever we do about this issue of post-truth and fake news doesn't undermine freedom of expression.
Yep, post-truth.
Yeah, and I broadly agree with that. I mean, there's no doubt that this is a particular spike in what has been a historic phenomenon of lies and even fake news in politics. I mean, as people have reflected on this subject, now they've seen examples from 100 years ago of people making up stories completely. But the plethora of this now, and having a president of the United States who clearly does frequently say things that are untrue, is a profound spike in that. Having said that, it is always encouraging to see moments when good old-fashioned policy differences or distinctions come out and actually do swing elections, like social policy in the British election. And you do feel like there's a sort of there's a movement back to there's a sort of reaction back. They said, well, let's talk about something that really matters and where we can have a genuine policy debate. So I'm not in despair about it. It's definitely a worry.
Okay, I'm going to move to Tim Dixon. Tim, let me put two questions to you. I mean, feel free on the post-truth thing. So the first is, you've masterminded a series of organizations and campaigns which began with online campaigns. Question is, does online campaigns make political engagement both too easy and too distant? You know, couch potatoes, sitting in their living rooms, clicking on petitions without actually mobilizing themselves and going out and meeting their counterparts. In other words, does it put at risk the kind of town hall politics which is more important to creating communities that have solidarity? And second, joined to that, and I ask this knowing what you've been doing of late and this last weekend, is how do we overcome these echo chambers and this world in which you can use social media individually to target, to separate, to magnify, to polarize, to create fear? What's the way forward? Is it on social media, or is it actually by creating in-person meeting places?
Thanks, Ari. I think on the first question, the first decade, in a sense, of online campaigning saw that sort of emergence of the petition model, the change.orgs, the Avazas, etc. I was involved in setting up some of those organisations. I think that that model has largely sort of run its course, because it doesn't mean much when somebody signs petitions now. It's, you know, the clicktivism, all of those critiques are true. It's a pretty shallow form of engagement. And I think what we're now moving towards is a much more integrated mix of online and offline. I think that piece of it's changing. But to understand the larger dynamics, I think you have to, I would step back from the focus on the sort of the means, the technology, and say, I mean, the large picture, as we've been discussing today, is there is an unprecedented level of disruption in politics. You know, look at France. The political establishment has just collapsed in France. It's extraordinary what has just happened in terms of the sort of, you know, almost disappearance of the left and right parties, and the emergence of a really, you know, young, relatively disorganised, under-resourced movement party with an interesting model of engagement, actually, that's, you know, won so dramatically. I mean, Trump is the end of the old Republican Party as well. You know, there is... And likewise, you know, Corbyn is the, you know, potentially the end of the old model of the Labor Party here. So there's a very high level of disruption. Not every country is recording that, but many, many countries are. Why? I think the large picture of this is where we've been doing quite a lot of quite deep opinion research around people's value systems in different countries, particularly focusing initially in France and Germany. But the picture we get across the board is pretty consistent. A large number of the sort of middle population, that is the people who don't have strong political views, are feeling disconnected from politics because they have a set of insecurities and anxieties, partly that Damian was speaking to, that politics just doesn't seem to deal with. So there's obviously the economic insecurities. People find it really hard to nominate what job their kids will have in the future. Just as one indicator of that, they find it hard to imagine what are the jobs of the future. Many of the certainties obviously have gone. There's the anxiety about security, terrorism, etc., which is, you know, very much uppermost in our minds. But thirdly also, and I think in some ways this is a thing that politicians miss, and I was a Prime Minister's speechwriter for many years, so I know that world from the inside. I kind of did that before the work I do now, which is more in the sort of civil society space. But the thing that people... that I see reading between, I mean, sitting in focus groups, you know, but conversations and the data that we see, it's just this sort of cultural anxiety of, you know, I feel like a stranger in the country, the very country I grew up in. I don't recognise England anymore. I don't recognise Sweden anymore. Of course, we often interpret that as a comment about immigration, but it's not actually just about that. It's more a sense of loss of belonging. I don't think much of our conventional politics speaks to the issue of belonging. You know, what's my relationship the community around me. And economic change and transience and many things are driving this. Now, for most of us who would be in the kind of liberal cosmopolitan group, as David Goodhart writes about the somewheres versus the anywheres, we belong more to the anywheres. They're about 30% of the population in the UK. We're relatively adrift from that concern because it's not our world. We comfortably move between countries and cultures, and we have our Apple Mac laptops, and we sit on our recycled wood benches in nice stainless steel and glass cafes, and drinking our flat whites or whatever. And so this sense of loss of belonging, this sense of the world's abandoned us, left us behind, it is really hard for us emotionally to engage with. I think one of the challenges is that this conversation about these dynamics is held by people who don't actually understand them all that well and live them.
Can I just pick you up on one thing in that? In an earlier session, we had Ali Hochschild presenting on strangers in their own land. I don't think she's in the other session. But what is striking in her portrayal of, as it were, the Trump voting folk of the very deep South, is they have a very strong belonging. They belong to their church communities, they belong to their towns, they do have this very strong sense of belonging. They feel left behind, and those two things are different. And are you saying it's different in Britain and people don't, the people who've lost faith in the establishment don't have that sense of belonging here, or would you separate belonging from feeling left behind as a group?
I do think there's a dynamic where the polarisation that's very acute in the United States and very politicised as well is between that kind of liberal cosmopolitan group and a sort of angry nationalist group. That angry nationalist group, and they are actually engaged, and they have a sense of belonging around their identity. I think the point is that, to me, a lot of the conversation, a lot of the debate that goes on is between those two polarities, and half the population's in the middle, and they have anxieties, but they also are people of decency and compassion and, some degree of worldliness, etc. And that middle group, this is the point I would say in David Goodhart's analysis that I would disagree with. I think there's a lot more people in that middle group who don't belong to this sort of left behind, who have elements of that, but other elements as well. And it's more complicated. And in a sense, politics needs to speak to that group more effectively. But I do think there is a difference in the United States. If you go and buy a arugula, you are making a statement of your sort of democratic inclinations. If you go and eat at Popeyes, whatever, or Cracker Barrel, you're a Republican. Politics has become culture, and culture has become politics. That's not happened here in the UK, and I think it's something that hopefully doesn't, infect the politics of other countries in the way it has in the US.
Thank you very much. So just to bring us back to our core topic, where trust between the general population and their ostensible representatives has in so many countries broken down or is eroding quite fast. And I think most people assume that one way back from that is better communication, but it's got to be two-way. And I think what we're trying to explore is, what should that better communication look like? So I'm going to invite the panelists to give us two positive suggestions of what the new communication should look like. But do we have any suggestions from the audience? I'm thinking that Bob's probably got some suggestions, or Eric. Certainly the minister from Denmark does.
Well, see if this goes through. Well, there's a thing you haven't touched upon, and that is how we as ministers or politicians loathe how the public communicates to us. Because
you loathe it.
I loathe it. Mm-hmm. And in periods I don't do anything on my Facebook because I loathe how rude people can be. And I never communicate with rudeness. I inform. So on one hand, it's strange that the population has never been so close to the politicians as they are now. And on the other hand, you talk a lot about alienation, which I do understand, don't misunderstand me. But how do we engage in communication if one side is attacking with rudeness. So you really don't want to communicate with the populations. Because if this had been a constituency meeting, nobody would say the things to me in my face as they communicate on my Facebook. So what is this doing to our communication?
Sure.
Say something about that. I think that's a really interesting and important point. And in the US, there's this fascination with town halls, with political town halls. It tends to be particularly pronounced in the first year of a new administration. It was very pronounced in the first year of the Obama administration around Obamacare. It's been very pronounced this year. And the narrative of those, of the reporting on the town halls, because of course very few people actually go to them, but the narrative of the reporting on them is, if people are nasty to politicians, that's the politician's fault. If people are shouting at the politician saying you don't understand, the politician is thereby demonstrably wrong. And what we're unable to convey is the sense that, and it is the reflection of the fact that people behave very badly in these events, and they behave very badly online, and they feel like they have license to do so to politicians, and it's very hard to create a narrative, create an environment in which polite but purposeful communication can go on between the representative and the represented, and it's a very interesting thing to observe around all of us.
You know, that said, there's some really interesting research that looks at West Africa and asks the question, can you use informing the public and town hall deliberations to actually get people to vote for political agendas rather than celebrity politicians? You could say about France that it's more about the arrival of celebrity politicians than anything else. But that research is very interesting, because if you inform the public, if you actually share with them two different policy platforms and then have them come and debate in a town hall, they tend less to vote for personalities and more to vote for agendas. And I think we need to start asking those kinds of questions. But let me now ask. Oh, yeah.
And they were quite raucous. We had about 900 people come out to a local community. Two things struck me. One was there was a lot of anger at that particular congressman, but it was incoherent. So people were very upset about how this congressman his stance was he was going to support the Republicans' plans to roll back health insurance. The congressman he's a lawyer, a very smart guy, knows a lot more about policy than almost everyone else in that room. So he had a very reasoned answer as to why this was actually going to be good. And people didn't know how to engage. They were still mad, but I'm going to lose my health insurance. He was talking about market reforms in 10 years, and people were very frustrated. So it, to me, illustrated the issue of engagement. And here are 900 people who hear from the media how these policies are going to take place. But the congressman, who knows much more about this, could easily deflect all the issues and the questions. It just made people angrier. So it was the lack of understanding by the people in the audience about the various policy trade-offs and differences that I found fascinating. There was no way for the public to engage, let's say, because you know as the minister far more about the policy than the angry people who are posting on your Facebook. And you don't have the time and ability to inform us all. So how do we bridge that gap of information?
So just to counter that a little bit, I mean, I have seen incredibly effective processes of engagement, but they start from a very different point to what you describe. When was the last time you saw a politician going into a room and saying, I just don't know the solution? I don't know. And what's more, I don't know what the problem is. So while they may be not experts in the policy, what they are experts in is their own lives and what they need and the assets that they might bring to the table. So there are ways of creating a much more level playing field where people can co-produce, both share the issues that they see, but also co-produce some of those problems. And we've seen that operating at a local level really interesting experiments in Salford, in Plymouth, in the UK, where actually you take people as a set of equals and come around problem solving. And one of the problems with experts is that we're all paid and promoted on knowing the answer. And actually, a lot of the time in a very complex system, we've not got a clue, and actually being a bit honest about that, and the politician walking in the room and saying, I don't have a clue, I think is part of the different form of conversation.
2 comments at the back.
I work at the Blavatnik School here, so one thing I'm particularly kind of like wondering is how you move from these kind of local personal platforms being something that people see as being often quite slow, bureaucratic, dusty places to being like, you know, something that people are actually kind of engaged in and regularly attending. So if you give any kind of examples of particular countries where these are genuinely well attended, and how they've actually managed to break this kind of pattern where people aren't coming to these kind of local events.
I do want to footnote the comment about the town halls, though, by saying that politicians do need to learn to listen, and listening doesn't mean listening to things that you love to hear. Listening does mean listening to anger. You know, I've seen genuine politicians sit and listen until the anger subsides. And it might take hours. But that patience and that listening, I think, is part of what it means to be, you know, to say that you're a representative. So I think there is this sort of 2 ways. Nemat at the back.
Nemat Bijan, research fellow at BSG. A little bit different question. From the other part of the world, developing world. In terms of engagement, so one of the questions is why, especially coming to politics and developing world, one of the focus of the politicians are how to manage perceptions. Coming to the social media, now is popular, common. I can give a number of examples that they are paying for social, for people or to manage social networks like Facebook, Twitter to propagate. So in terms of communication, that seems to be or have proved to be counterproductive, because what happened that undermined the trust between politicians and people. On the other hand, another factor is that they're trying, so I discuss here on a particular context, to hire communication experts who are well trusted by people in order to bridge the gap between politicians, government, and society. But here the problem is they rely too much on that instead of changing policy. They do not change policy, but in order to rely on communication to manage perceptions. I wonder what you...
Great, thank you very much. So let's pick up some of these questions now. So there's one from the Minister about the rudeness, and it's not just rudeness, it's threats, violence. There's evidence in Britain that the trolling and violent, aggressive behaviour online is, for example, forcing women sort of out of politics. It feels too threatening and so forth. Is there a solution to that, Damian? And what would your 2 ideas about ways forward be on how to on how politicians could better communicate with citizens?
It is a huge problem, and it does affect women more than it affects men, but I can only imagine what it's like to be in a position of a minister receiving these kinds of communications. There are different ways of looking at it. We could see this as a question of learning, and that, you know, we're going through a process whereby, for example, the balance between anonymity and identifying users is being finessed. Some of those Facebook users will be identifiable to you and their friends, and there will be a way in which society and self-regulation will take care of this. But it may need some kind of new codification of rules by Facebook, by the platforms. And I think we should be very, very careful about imposing regulatory solutions for the obvious free expression. So for you personally, I think we're going to have to bear with this. But there's another important point, which is even given that kind of communication, governments must listen. And there is some interesting research. I was trying to recall the author of the book. I think the title of the book is How Governments Listen. And the author wrote a post on the LSE Media Policy Project blog. He's researched the different listening opportunities for government, whether that's in terms of complaints or in terms of formal consultations, and identifies that there is quite a deficit in the ability of organisational listening and actually building the policy of listening and a strategy for improving the way that internal bureaucratic processes are able to process different forms of societal discussion. That itself, i.e. Making your ministry or your organisation more able to listen and more aware of the different listening opportunities, is a problem, is a practical issue in itself. And I think that there's
2 tips on how to do it from someone who's read the book.
Well, I think one of them is to be absolutely clear about the status of the consultation or the engagement. People don't engage partly because they don't know whether in any way it's rational to contribute to a consultation, to take part in a policy process, because they don't know if anybody's really listening and they don't have a clear idea of how that information is likely to be taken into account. So by developing a listening strategy, you can communicate that better and you can actually give people rational reasons to engage with communication. Final point is that people have been talking about trust and talking about that kind of loss of trust between political representatives and citizens. And I think we should be a little bit careful about saying whether trust in itself is a problem. We should be talking about due trust. Some representatives, for reasons we understand, should not be trusted. Sorry to make that point, but we should not think that more trust in itself is a good thing. People need to be critical about politics, and that will make politicians and politics better, hopefully.
Great. So we've got our first solution, which is that governments should develop a listening strategy, that different departments of governments should develop a listening strategy. What's the next?
Well, look, this is more in the way of how do you advise people engaged in this arena? And I think in terms exclusively of ease here, things beginning with E, you're seeking empathy and you're seeking engagement. How do you do that? I think it's that there are 2 predominant kind of mindsets, if you like, that you want to adopt in order to achieve empathy and engagement. The first is that of the entrepreneur who is building something. People in politics, people in civil society are naturally entrepreneurial. They're trying to build something, and they're most successful when they yield the attacker's advantage. Effectively, they're going against an incumbent or against the very notion of incumbency, and they're trying to be disruptive. So I think that entrepreneurship model is extremely important. But I'd also say, in the context of particularly the last year, that the entertainment mindset is also pretty significant. What we've sometimes ignore is that politics at its best is supremely entertaining. Whatever the rights and wrongs of the Trump campaign, it was very entertaining. It got people out of their homes at very short notice into these huge arenas. It was, to a large degree, a kind of rock music tour. If it was good at anything, it was at figuring out how to get people to want to come to these rallies. It's proving difficult to replicate that in government. But politics and civil action need to be sufficiently entertaining that people want to spend their time engaged in it and want to feel like they are involved in it. And that's a really important dimension of our society now.
But Nick, I'm looking for free advice. So if I were just a recently elected member of parliament and I came to you and said, you know, I've read all the things that the panel at the Blavatnik School said, and I realize I need to engage with citizens and I need a listening strategy and I need to get them to town hall meetings so it's not just me and two citizens that wanted a free cup of tea. You know, what's the advice? What would you say to me as a newly elected MP? What should be my communication strategy?
I mean, impossible question, obviously. No, look, I think if you can clearly articulate what is different about what you're proposing from the incumbent model, then you've got a starting point. But you do, as I say, you have to be entertaining about it. You have to be able to engage people in a sort of almost a conversation about this. And maybe that's the free advice. Figure out what kind of conversation you want to have.
Brilliant. Thank you. And Tim?
To sort of bring that piece about entertainment into another realm, I think of it as agency and a sense of participation or control. Think of the way people participate in reality TV to sort of vote up their favourite star in a talent contest. That's an example of democratic participation, in a sense, and people feel a sense of agency when they do that. Politics doesn't give people that many experiences of their agency and their contribution in a way that's meaningful. I think the Republic En Marche model is really interesting to watch. It hasn't been reported much in the English-speaking press, but the model that they have, the municipal structure, I mean, they've literally held hundreds and hundreds of meetings. They've more than doubled their membership since the election, since the Macron's election. But they have a really interesting combination of community organising. Essentially, they're trying to do in France what Obama wanted to do but never did, the failure to translate that sort of organising infrastructure built around 2008 into actually governing. En Marche is trying to do exactly that. I think it's worth really tracking that model because it goes right down to this sort of municipal approach so that, and they've surveyed their membership extensively about their views on different issues. And so when Macron or one of his, the deputies come to a local community, they're actually able to say, we know the priorities in this community are really around mental health because that's come up so strongly in the feedback you've given us. So it's it's the combination of data and face-to-face. And I think that's a model really worth looking into. The same thing, just in terms of where I think solutions, there is a problem about the relationship between politicians and the people. But I think the bigger issue, and I know that deeply, I was a good friend of Jo Cox, and Jo we used to literally sit at her dinner table going through the Facebook feed and the horrific stuff that women in politics get. It's dreadful. Never imagined that would translate into anything real. But the larger issue actually that we're dealing with is the hostility between people who no longer agree. That's what frightens me even more. I mean, Jonathan Haidt, The Righteous Mind, he talks about his belief that America is heading towards civil war if it continues in its current trajectory of complete inability to communicate across that political division. So we need to, and that's the work that we've just done this weekend, the great get-together around the anniversary of Joe's death, but 120,000 registered events across the country, millions of people participating, and just seeing all the feedback that we got over the weekend from people saying, it's just so great to connect with other people in my community who are different from me. We don't have these opportunities to. And that message of we have more in common, I think it's a very powerful message. It crosses cultures, and finding positive ways to re-engage with people with understanding that you can be very different from each other, but still have what you have in common is so much more. That's the basics of a democracy, having trust in each other. And I think we need to do a lot of rebuilding of that because the social media, the hyperconnection, is actually creating this increased polarisation and distrust where we're growing a generation who don't believe they have anything in common with the people who disagree with them. So we need to find ways to break that down. If we don't do that, our entire politics of our democratic systems is going to collapse.
Thank you, Tim. Just before we finish, let's take some quick commentary from the audience, including a a suggestion from Bob Klitgaard. If you can bring a microphone to, yeah, we'll start at the back and give him 1 second to collect his thoughts. And from Eric Braverman as well. Thank you. So yes,
thank you.
Flurry of thoughts,
Yes.
quite brief if you could all.
Just a question, a different question for a different part of the world. I'm from Venezuela. As you know, Venezuela is in the middle of a social and economic collapse. Just to give you an idea, in the last 4 years, 1/3 of the total GDP disappeared. We have 5 years with the highest inflation in the world. The poverty doubled in the last 3 years. Now, it doesn't matter what's your ideological or theoretical background, you have to take tough decisions, difficult decisions. How do you communicate those decisions without dying in the attempt?
We're going to just take these comments. We don't have time to answer them, so we're going to take them as comments and questions for us all to think about. Could we move the microphone up to Bob's suggestion?
I'm interested in a slightly different question, which is once you're in office and you're trying to rule or govern, what's your communication strategy then? Not campaigning, but what I find is many governments are not good at doing that. They kind of forget that function. And the main thing they forget is to trumpet examples of success. So you know that book by the Heath brothers called Made to Stick, Why Some Ideas Perish and Others Succeed or Sustain Themselves. There's a mnemonic device at the end of the book to remember all the stories in the book. It's full of stories. And that mnemonic device is success. What people remember is specific, not general, unexpected, concrete, credible, emotional stories. And so when you're trying to persuade the people of the Republic of Georgia that things are better than they were before, you have been listening to those stories, you have been out there, but now you're out there telling things and bringing people who are credible along with you. So I think that's a very important part of this. And I'll just give one more analogy just to leave you something that might be fun. I'm told that in evangelism, Christian evangelism, they have a little refrain to advise people how to market the Lord. And it is your story, my story, God's story. And the point is, if you want to begin telling somebody something, you begin with their story. What's your story? And then you connect that with your story as a candidate or as a school. And then you talk about a policy area or a story you're trying to sell, economic reform or better care for the mentally ill or whatever it might be. And you have that connection between those three things. So if you can start doing that about the things, if you're a candidate, you have three things you really care about, right? Three policy issues. Connect that with your story, but then when you got to go out and listen to those other stories first, I think, before you do that.
Very good. Li Fan?
Oh, yes. I just have a question. I think there were rumors that Donald Trump may need a new communication director in the White House. And what if you receive an invitation to be the new one? And what do you think of his Twitter-style political communication? Actually, he has been very much at the core of the debate about...
Li Fan, I think you have to give us your answers in 2 words. Would you take the job?
I don't know.
Right. Mary, if we can just pass it around. Yep.
So far the questions in a way focused on developed countries, and my question is going to be in developing country context, where partly due to lack of checks and balances in the system, some democracies have been transformed into the so-called illiberal democracies. Even in the case of the EU, we have Hungary. It's a very problematic instance. And I was wondering, in such political environments where the opposition parties actually don't have the same equal opportunities of campaigning, what could be the alternative ways for the opposition parties to engage with the citizens when the mass media is controlled by the government? Thank you.
Great. And there was a last point. Lenny, were you going to make a point?
Yeah. I think when you're talking about engaging, we are always engaging. That's my perception with the same people, that the engageable. There are some people that are just left behind or beside and are not part of the conversation. So how to make these people that are not interested in listening, how make these interesting for them?
Great. Well, look, we're out of time. Can I finish with just 4 takeaways that I would take from this conversation and from the experts that are flanking me. So from Damian, it's the idea that each part of government should have a listening strategy, and that a strategy means that you are very clear about why you're consulting people and what impact what they tell you is going to have. I think a second point is Nick Lovegrove's point that politicians need to articulate their purpose more clearly and more purposefully. I'm not, when you talk about they need to think about the conversation they wish to have. Although that said, I think a lot of the panel was about beware of trying to control communication and prefabricate it. That's proven not to work. Tim's point about giving agency to people, mobilizing communities. So not just a top-down politics, but curating the way communities work. And in a way, Jeremy Corbyn did that in the last election. He mobilized people. And I think he's an interesting counterpoint to the idea that that I think both Nick and Tim had about politicians needing to be entertainers. I think they can be quiet mobilizers. They don't always have to be entertainers. Yes, yes, but Jeremy Corbyn's not an absolute bag of jokes, but he's proven to be a great and to many people surprising mobilizer. And then finally on Bob Klitgaard's, oh, we didn't get Eric's point. Eric, did you have a point?
I think the one point I would make is we're talking a lot about communication as speech, and picking up on Tim's point. I think it'd be really interesting to think about communication also as action, because we communicate in what we do as much as what we say. And thinking about once we've heard what people have to say and done that listening you talked about, well, what comes next?
What comes next? Terrific. And it actually segues nicely into my fourth point, which builds on what both Bob Klitgaard and Eric Braverman have said. The your story, my story, God's story, for me, it's a 4-point checklist. When I hear a politician speaking to a community, because it's not just about what the politician is saying, it's about what she or he has listened to before they're speaking. And my checklist is 1, does he actually know what this community cares about? Is he using their language to describe it? 2, is she prepared to say what she cannot do? Is she prepared to say, I feel your pain, you're all unemployed. Actually, I cannot give all of you a job in the next 6 months. So that's 2, and it's a kind of trust-building move. And the third is, does the politician actually have a plan which relates to the number 1 concern of that audience? Do they have a plan, or do they just have waffle? Because number 3 is that. What is the plan, and how will it be implemented? And how will the community know it's being implemented? And 4th, and only after the first 3, is what do the sunny uplands look like? You know, if the plan is executed, what is the positive place that we might all end up in? And to me, that's the kind of checklist. And when a politician, so many politicians skip straight to number 4, and therefore it's not credible. It shows a failure to listen, a failure to plan, a failure to deliver. Can I thank all of you for kicking off this conversation this afternoon, but could you share with me an applause for Damian on my left, for Nick, and for Tim, and those of you who participated, for bringing so much to this conversation. Thank you. And my apologies for the sound system and its upping and downing. It'll all be solved by tomorrow, I'm sure. Do join with everybody else for drinks in the inner